Hello, JBS viewers. I'm David Harris, and this is Defending Israel. A very happy, sweet, and meaningful Pesach, Passover, to all of you celebrating the holiday. Our guest this week is Hillel Neuer, the renowned executive director of United Nations Watch, based in Geneva, and a tenacious defender of human rights and the proper place of Israel in the global community. And in the interest of full disclosure, I should say that many years ago, I succeeded the late Morris Abram, the founder of United Nations Watch, and served for an interim period as the chair of UN Watch, and subsequently as the host at the American Jewish Committee for UN Watch when Hillel Neuer was hired. The UN Watch today is an independent organization, and I'm delighted to have Hillel on the show. Welcome, Hillel.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hillel, just dial back for a moment before we explore the issues today and tell those viewers who are not familiar with UN Watch how and why it was founded in 1993, and briefly what the journey has been until today.
Sure. It was founded by a great American named Morris Abram, whom you mentioned briefly. He was a civil rights leader. He was active in the 1950s, helping Martin Luther King before it was a fashionable cause. He helped get Martin Luther King out of prison, introduced him to the Kennedy family, and eventually Morris Abram was renowned himself for having won the 1963 case of Gray versus Saunders, achieving the recognition by the United States Supreme Court of one man, one vote at a time when in Georgia, through manipulation of certain county systems, the votes of black people were not being counted fairly, and Morris Abram defeated that. And he was president of the American Jewish Committee, a leader of the Soviet Jewry movement, and many other important causes, and eventually was named U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in Europe. And when he retired in 1993, he remained in Geneva, and having been ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Commission, as it was then called, he understood many of the serious defects facing the UN. He supported the United Nations, but he knew that it had to be held to account. Americans especially appreciate the concept of checks and balances. Sadly, they don't really exist at the United Nations, and Morris Abrams saw the need for an outside body that would fight on universal issues, holding the UN to account, speaking out for the founding principles of the UN Charter, and also fighting anti-Semitism and the unequal treatment of Israel. And that's how it was established in 1993, initially under the auspices of the World Jewish Congress, then under the umbrella of the American Jewish Committee, now, as you mentioned, for the past decade or so, independent. And today we continue to speak out for the rights of Jewish people not to be discriminated against in so many ways at the UN when Israel is targeted, and various anti-Semitic experts are appointed to the UN, like Francesca Albanese, to name just one.
We're going to get to her in a moment.
Yeah, and we're active for human rights. So in May of this year, on May 15th, UN Watch will host the 16th annual Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy, featuring some of the leading dissidents who've either been in prison or their family members are in prison from China, Cuba, Russia, Venezuela, and other serial human rights abusing countries.
Hillel, as I knew Morris quite well before he passed away, I remember that one of the things that he said was, after spending 4 years in Geneva as the U.S. ambassador, he realized that Geneva was really a dirty, dark little secret, that there were very few journalists based in Geneva. Most of the attention was focused on New York, on First Avenue and 43rd Street, but that a lot was going on in Geneva that most people never saw, but that was really quite pernicious. Can you, first of all, construct for us what goes on in Geneva for those who may only be familiar with the UN in New York, and then what is it that is so pernicious potentially?
Sure. Look, the UN, I would say, has two major campuses. There's more than two, but the major ones, of course, are New York, where the United Nations General Assembly, which is considered the parliament of the UN, all 193 member states have a seat there. The Security Council, of course, the most senior authority at the United Nations, and then the Secretary General and his leading advisors, among other things. Those are some of the leading institutions in New York. And Geneva is host to maybe 20 different specialized agencies. Some of the most famous ones are the World Health Organization, obviously became very well known during COVID, but it's something that is needed throughout the year. The International Labor Organization, one of the oldest international bodies, precedes the UN by many years. The World Trade Organization in Geneva, the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, and many other agencies. One of the more notorious ones is what's now known as the Human Rights Council. They meet 3 times a year. They adopt resolutions, create commissions of inquiry. So those are just some of the many agencies. There's others dealing with telecommunications, intellectual property, and so on. Those are the UN. And of course, UN adjacent, you might say, are agencies like the ICRC, the International Committee for the Red Cross, which some people, certainly those who care about Israel, will be deeply concerned on how they have failed to step up to the plate in the past 6 months regarding the hostages. Not that they could do everything, but there's clearly more that they could have done. And also, the ICRC has been, when they make pronouncements, singling out Israel. And of course, their new director general, starting on April 1st, they named Pierre Krahenbuhl, who was the former head of UNRWA and someone who had to resign in a very major scandal, mismanagement, abuse of power that he presided over. And despite all that, he was named head of ICRC. So those might be some of the kinds of things, perhaps that Morris Abrams sensed, that are going on in Geneva.
So if I remember correctly, it was probably about 2006 that then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan led a process of reviewing and reforming, or so he thought, what was called the UN Human Rights Commission, now the Council. Has it in fact been reformed, or is it as bad as it was then?
Well, they did make some changes, but in terms of the essential defects that they were meant to cure, sadly, they have not done so. And in some ways, it's actually gotten worse. So the main issue that Kofi Annan identified was politicization, selectivity, and the membership. He talked about the fact that members were joining not to defend human rights, but to shield their own abuses and those of their allies. And if we look today at the members of the reformed Human Rights Council, we see members such as China, Cuba, Kazakhstan, Pakistan. Some of the world's worst dictatorships are sitting on the Human Rights Council or sat for many years, like Russia and Venezuela were on for many years until recently. And actually, if you count the numbers, 60% of the current members failed to meet the minimal standards of a free democracy established by Freedom House. They're either full-on dictatorships or other forms of non-democracies. And of course, if those are the members, what you're going to get is a corresponding result, which is a body that's not actually defending human rights, but in many cases is subverting human rights.
And just to put a fine point on this, am I correct in remembering that it was 2003 perhaps that Libya, Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, was elected to chair the UN Human Rights Commission, correct?
That is correct. And just for people to have a bit of context, the founding chair in 1946, when it all began, was none other than Eleanor Roosevelt, the great humanitarian of the age. And so 1946, Eleanor Roosevelt, and indeed, as you said, David, 2003, the regime of brutal dictator Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, 2003.
And while we're speaking about this, Hillel, and I want to really now sort of delve into the current issues and Israel's place in it, but we're talking about the fact that Iran, a subject that you've been advocating very loudly and powerfully about, it sits on both the Women's Commission and on the Disarmament Commission. Is it not the current chair today, as we meet, you and I, the chair of the UN's Disarmament Committee? Or is that just an extended April Fool's joke?
No, sadly, it is true. Iran is not only a member of the UN Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, but it is currently the chair until May. Now, it should be noted that its chairmanship was took place as a result of an alphabetic rotation. But having said that, when North Korea took its seat, when Syria took its seat, numerous countries took the floor and said that this was outrageous and that those countries had no credibility to hold the chairmanship. Sadly, when Iran took its seat about a month ago, there was maybe a handful of statements, but nothing notable by our democracies. And that may have sent the wrong signal among other wrong signals that are being sent on Iran. In New York at the Women's Rights Commission, Iran was elected a couple of years ago. Because of the Women Life Freedom Movement, there was a reversal, and America, which had been silent when Iran was elected, the Biden administration initially was silent and refused to comment when Iran was elected to the Women's Rights Commission, which is known as the Commission on the Status of Women. But after the Women Life Freedom Movement broke out with the death in custody of Mahsa Amini, a young woman who was arrested and died in custody after apparently being beaten for having worn an improper hijab. Revolution broke out on the streets of Iran, or an attempt of peaceful demonstrations. And in wake of that crackdown, the United States led an effort in December of 2022 to actually remove Iran, something we were active on and campaigning for, had never happened before, and Iran was actually expelled. Sadly, recently, Saudi Arabia, a country which is making advances, we acknowledge that, but it still has one of the world's worst records on women's rights. Male guardians are still needed for women to do many things. Saudi Arabia was recently elected chair of the Women's Rights Commission. So sadly, UN doesn't seem to be taking its own principles very seriously.
Hillel, you mentioned the United States. JBS viewers may or may not remember that there was a period of time where the United States had withdrawn entirely from the Human Rights Council. From your perspective, Hillel, was it the right decision of the United States to return, or should it have continued to stay out?
You know, I think it's a dilemma. In my 20 years in this position, I saw the United States pull out twice. Once was in 2006, shortly after the Human Rights Council was reformed and created. And then that was under the presidency of George W. Bush. When Obama was elected, he brought America back. And then it happened again at, I'd say, midpoint during the Trump administration. Nikki Haley and John Bolton announced that the U.S. would be pulling out of the Human Rights Council. Now, in my experience, I think you gain something when you pull out, you lose something. You gain something because America makes a statement saying this body is not legitimate. So that's an important point to be made. But you do lose something because the body continues, and most countries do take it seriously. Its resolutions, when it creates commissions of inquiry, its reports do get quoted around the world. So my ideal, and it's hard to get that, we often get, I would say, extremes on each side. My ideal would be to have someone present at the UN, like a Patrick Moynihan in 1975, who gave that incredible speech calling out the Zionism is racism resolution, and like Nikki Haley, who was so articulate when she took the floor, whether it was that Security Council or the General Assembly, in calling out the abuses of the UN. So I wish that America would have someone with that kind of backbone and would be present and calling out the abuses. That would really, in my opinion, have the best effect. Sadly, we usually get one or another extreme. We usually get either the Republicans are absent, or we get Democrats who may often vote the right way, but often end up being cheerleaders. The Obama administration and the Biden administration have become cheerleaders for the Human Rights Council. And, you know, one could understand a little bit of diplomatic realpolitik requiring them to say certain niceties from time to time, but sadly they've erred on the side of being cheerleaders of the Human Rights Council.